where the dust of the Sahel coats everything in a fine orange haze, where children walk kilometers to reach schools that sometimes have no desks, no electricity, no running water, where a university degree was, for decades, a privilege reserved for the sons and daughters of the elite, where the colonial language, French, was the only gateway to knowledge, and the only path to a career led to Paris, Lyon, or Brussels. This place is Burkina Faso, the land of upright men. And today, something is changing here. Something quiet but profound. Something that could reshape the future of an entire generation. Because today, instead of looking west, thousands of young Burkinabe are looking east. They are learning a new language. They are boarding planes to a country their grandparents never imagined they would visit. They are filling lecture halls in Moscow, St. Petersburg, Novosibirsk, and Kazan. And they are coming home with degrees, with skills, with connections, and with a fundamentally different vision of what their country can become. This is the story of 3,500 Burkinabe students in Russia. And it is a story about far more than education. It is a story about sovereignty, about identity, and about the quiet revolution that happens when a nation decides to rewrite the rules of who gets to learn and from whom. If you believe in this vision, if you believe that Africa deserves to choose its own partners and its own future, then I ask you to do something simple before we begin. Hit the like button, go to the comments, and write "Long live Traoré." Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. Because this is a story the mainstream media will never tell you. And the more people see it, the harder it becomes to ignore. To understand why 3,500 Burkinabe students are studying in Russia today, you first need to understand what came before. For 60 years after independence, Burkina Faso's educational system remained essentially a French creation. The curriculum was designed in Paris. The textbooks were printed in France. The language of instruction was French, a language that many children in rural Burkina Faso did not even speak at home. The universities in Ouagadougou and Bobo-Dioulasso were modeled on French institutions, staffed largely by French-trained professors, and oriented toward producing graduates who could function within the Francophone system. And the scholarship pipelines, they led to France, to Belgium, to Canada. The best and brightest Burkinabe students were funneled toward French-speaking universities in Europe, where they studied French law, French economics, French engineering. Some of them came back, many did not. The phenomenon known as brain drain was not accidental. It was structural. The educational system was designed to produce graduates who would be most useful to the former colonial power, not to the country that had raised them. For decades, this was simply how things worked. No one questioned it, because there seemed to be no alternative. Where else would a Burkinabe student go? The answer, for a growing number of young people, is now clear. The relationship between Burkina Faso and Russia in education is not actually new. It has roots that stretch back to the Soviet era. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union offered thousands of scholarships to students from newly independent African nations. The program was massive. At its peak, tens of thousands of African students were studying in Soviet universities at any given time. They studied engineering, medicine, agriculture, military science, and nuclear physics. They learned Russian. They formed friendships and sometimes families with Soviet citizens. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, everything changed overnight. The scholarships dried up. The embassies closed. In Burkina Faso, the Russian embassy shut its doors in 1992 and did not reopen for 31 years. An entire generation of Burkinabe grew up without any connection to Russia whatsoever. The alumni of Soviet universities, those engineers and doctors who had studied in Moscow and Leningrad, became an aging, forgotten community. Their Russian language skills, once a professional asset, became a nostalgic curiosity. But they never forgot. and in the cities of Burkina Faso, in quiet meeting halls and private gatherings, the alumni of Soviet universities kept meeting. They kept speaking Russian to each other. They kept alive a memory of a partnership that had once meant something. They were waiting, without knowing it, for a moment that would arrive 3 decades later. That moment came with Captain Ibrahim Traoré. When Traoré took power in September 2022, he inherited a country in crisis. Nearly half the territory was under the control of jihadist groups. Millions were displaced. The economy was stagnant, and the educational system, like everything else, was broken. Universities were underfunded. Research was almost non-existent. The country was producing graduates who could not find work because the skills they had been taught did not match the needs of a developing nation. Traoré understood something that many leaders before him had failed to grasp: that education is not just about individual advancement, it is about national survival. A country that cannot train its own engineers cannot build its own roads. A country that cannot train its own doctors cannot care for its own people. A country that cannot train its own scientists cannot exploit its own natural resources. And a country that depends entirely on a single foreign partner for its educational infrastructure is not truly independent. So Traoré began to diversify. He began to look for new partners who could offer what Burkina Faso needed most: practical skills, technical training, and a partnership model that was not built on dependency. And one of the first places he looked was Russia. The numbers tell a remarkable story. In the 2024 to 2025 academic year, the Russian government more than doubled the scholarship quota for Burkinabe students. Where once there had been a handful of scholarships each year, there were now dozens, with 27 additional fully funded places announced by President Putin himself during a bilateral meeting in the Kremlin. The total cost would be covered entirely by the Russian federal budget: tuition, housing, stipends, everything. And the demand was staggering. When Russia opened applications for African students in 2025, more than 40,000 applications poured in from across the continent. This was twice the number from the previous year. Among the most enthusiastic applicants were young Burkinabe who saw in Russia an opportunity that the West had never offered them: a chance to study advanced subjects in world-class facilities without paying a single franc. Today, more than 3,500 Burkinabe students have received their education in Russia. That number encompasses both current students and alumni. They are studying in cities spread across the Russian Federation, from Moscow to Novosibirsk, from St. Petersburg to Kazan. They are enrolled in programs ranging from nuclear engineering to agricultural science, from medicine to mathematics, from computer science to military studies. But the story does not begin at the airport. It begins in Ouagadougou, in a building that has become one of the most important institutions in modern Burkina Faso. In January 2024, a non-governmental Russian cultural center opened its doors in the heart of Burkina Faso's capital. It was called the Russian House, and it was established under an agreement between the Center for Public Diplomacy and Rosotrubnichestvo, the Russian government's agency for cultural and humanitarian cooperation. The timing was symbolic. Just weeks earlier, in December 2023, the Russian embassy in Ouagadougou had officially resumed operations after being closed for 31 years. The Russian House was designed to be much more than an office. It was conceived as a gateway, a bridge between two cultures separated by thousands of kilometers, but connected by a shared history and shared aspirations. And from the very first day, the demand was overwhelming. Russian language courses were the centerpiece. When the doors opened, 120 students enrolled immediately, but the waiting list quickly grew to 1,200 people. 1,200 Burkinabe citizens, many of them young professionals and university students, waiting for a chance to learn Russian. Think about what that means. In a country where French has been the dominant language for over a century, 1,200 people were lining up to learn the language of Pushkin and Tolstoy, of Gagarin and Mendeleev. The students came from every walk of life. Some were university graduates looking to boost their career prospects. They understood that as Russian companies began to invest in Burkina Faso, speaking Russian would become a valuable professional skill. Some were students hoping to qualify for scholarships to study in Russia. The Russian language was their ticket to a new future. Some were simply curious, drawn by a sense that the cultural winds were shifting and that Russia represented something different, something that was not weighed down by the baggage of colonialism. The Russian house quickly became a vibrant cultural hub. Russian language courses were just the beginning. Film screenings brought Russian cinema to Burkinabe audiences. Art exhibitions showcased Russian culture. A daily radio show called Russian Time began broadcasting in Ouagadougou, with hosts speaking a lively mixture of French and Russian. Football tournaments were organized. Sambo demonstrations were held. Graffiti festivals celebrated the partnership between the two nations. A week-long celebration of Russian language and culture was organized in collaboration with Novosibirsk State Technical University, bringing Russian academics to Ouagadougou to teach and share knowledge. By January 2026, the Russian House celebrated its second anniversary with a ceremony attended by the Minister of Communications, Culture, Art, and Tourism, the Charge d'Affaires of the Russian Embassy, representatives of the Prime Minister's office, and the ambassador of Burkina Faso to Russia. The minister publicly confirmed his support for the Russian House's programs and invited Russian creative teams to participate in the Week of National Culture in Bobo-Dioulasso. This was not just a cultural event. It was a statement of national policy. And at the center of all of this was education. Because for Captain Traoré, the Russian House and the scholarship programs were not separate initiatives. They were parts of a single strategy to build a generation of Burkinabe professionals who could drive the country's development without depending on the West. Let me tell you what it looks like for a young Burkinabe student to go to Russia. Imagine you are 20 years old, from a modest family in Koudougou or Banfora. You have done well in school. You speak French and your local language. You have dreams of becoming an engineer, a doctor, a scientist. But the universities in Burkina Faso are overcrowded and underfunded. Studying in France is prohibitively expensive, even with scholarships. And the visa process is humiliating. You feel, as so many young Africans feel, that the doors to the future are closed. Then, you hear about the Russian scholarship program. You apply through the official platform. You are accepted. Your tuition is covered. Your housing is arranged. You receive a monthly stipend. But first, you must learn Russian. So you spend your first year in an intensive language preparatory course, studying Russian from scratch, learning to read Cyrillic, to conjugate Russian verbs, to navigate the grammatical complexities of a language that is entirely unlike anything you have ever spoken before. It is hard. The winters in Moscow or Novosibirsk are brutal for someone who has never experienced temperatures below 15 degrees. The food is different. The culture is different. Loneliness is real. But so is the opportunity. You are sitting in lecture halls at institutions that have produced Nobel laureates, cosmonauts, and world-class engineers. You are learning from professors who are experts in their fields. You are studying alongside students from across Africa, from Asia, from Latin America, from the former Soviet republics. You are building a network that spans the globe. And then, 5 or 6 years later, you return to Burkina Faso. You speak Russian, French, and your local language. You have a degree in nuclear engineering, or mining technology, or agricultural science, or medicine. You have skills that your country desperately needs, and you have a perspective that no one who stayed behind can fully understand. You have seen another way of doing things. You have lived in a country that, despite its own enormous challenges, manage to industrialize, to build world-class infrastructure, to develop advanced technology. Now multiply that story by 3,500. 3,500 young Burkinabe, returning home or currently studying, each one carrying knowledge and skills and connections that could transform their communities, their industries, their country. This is not charity. This is investment. For Russia, the calculus is clear. Every Burkinabe student who studies in Russia becomes a bridge between the two countries. They speak Russian. They understand Russian culture. They have professional contacts in Russian institutions. When Russian companies look to invest in Burkina Faso's mining sector, its energy infrastructure, its agricultural technology, they will find a generation of Burkinabe professionals who can work with them seamlessly. Education is the softest form of power and arguably the most durable. Captain Traoré himself emphasized this during a meeting with Putin in May 2025, on the occasion of the 80th anniversary of Victory Day in Moscow. Traoré told Putin that cooperation in scientific education, particularly in mathematics, physics, and chemistry, was a key area of partnership. He noted the growing interest among Burkinabe students in Russian universities, and he personally requested an increase in student scholarships. But Traoré went further. He articulated a philosophy that connects education to sovereignty. In his words, having a strong army involves building and training staff. And he asked Russia for something specific: the transfer of technology and know-how, and sharing of experience. Not finished products, not dependency-creating handouts. Knowledge, skills, the tools to build independently. This philosophy extends beyond military matters. When Burkina Faso signed a memorandum of understanding with Russia on higher education and science cooperation, the 5-year framework was explicitly designed to facilitate the exchange of information and expertise, the joint organization of academic activities, and the design of academic mobility programs for students, teachers, and researchers. The agreement included university exchanges, internships, and summer schools. Burkinabe authorities said the agreement addresses a strategic need to build local skills, and the fields of study reflect national priorities. Burkinabe students in Russia are not studying French literature or European philosophy. They are studying engineering because Burkina Faso needs to build roads, bridges, factories, and power plants. They are studying mining technology because Burkina Faso sits on enormous mineral wealth that for decades was extracted by foreign companies with minimal benefit to the local population. They are studying agriculture because Traoré has declared food self-sufficiency a national security priority and achieved it in 2025. They are studying medicine because the healthcare system needs trained professionals. They are studying military science because the country is fighting a war against terrorism. There is a deeper story here, one that goes beyond the numbers and the policy announcements. It is the story of what happens to a young person's mind when they realize that the world is bigger than they were told. For generations, Burkinabe students grew up in an educational system that pointed in one direction: France. The entire structure of knowledge, the entire hierarchy of intellectual prestige flowed from Africa to Europe. French universities were presented as the pinnacle of learning. French culture was presented as the model of civilization. French language was the language of advancement. When a young Burkinabe goes to Russia, that narrative cracks. They discover that there are other ways of organizing a society, other approaches to science and technology, other models of development. They discover that a country can be vast, powerful, and technologically advanced without being Western. They discover that the knowledge they need to build their country does not have to come with the strings of cultural submission. This is what Traoré means when he talks about sovereignty. It is not just about who controls the gold mines or who provides the weapons. It is about who shapes the minds of the next generation. And by diversifying Burkina Faso's educational partnerships, by sending students to Russia, to China, to Turkey, to India, Traoré is breaking the monopoly that France once held over the intellectual formation of his country's elite. The broader picture is staggering. Russia allocated more than 5,000 state-funded university places for African students in the 2025 academic year alone. More than 40,000 Africans applied for these spots, twice as many as the previous year. The highest number of applicants came from Sudan, Guinea, Ghana, and Chad. But Burkina Faso, with its doubled quota and growing enthusiasm, was among the most active participants. Russia is also expanding its network of cultural and education centers across Africa. The Russian houses, those non-governmental cultural centers that function as gateways to Russian education, are now operating in Ouagadougou, Bamako, Niamey, Dakar, Luanda, Dar es Salaam, Addis Ababa, Cairo, Lusaka, Brazzaville, and Bangui. Each one offers free Russian language courses, cultural programs, and scholarship guidance. Each one is a seed planted for a long-term relationship. In Burkina Faso specifically, the Russian House has become an official partner of the Ministry of Secondary, Vocational, and Technical Education and Training. A joint institute is being planned between the Polytechnic University of Ouagadougou and Novosibirsk State Technical University in Russia. Russian language and culture weeks have become annual events. Plans are being made to invite the Russian ballet to Burkina Faso, to organize touring symphony orchestras and dance ensembles, and to hold Russian film festivals. And on the streets of Ouagadougou, the signs of transformation are visible everywhere. Russian flags fly alongside Burkinabe flags. Walls are covered with pro-Russian graffiti. Posters advertising free Russian language courses hang at the iconic United Nations roundabout in the city center. A daily radio show called Russian Time broadcasts in a mixture of French and Russian. Young people walk around in t-shirts bearing Russian slogans. This is not propaganda, or if it is a form of propaganda that comes with tangible benefits. Every Russian language course is free. Every scholarship is fully funded. Every cultural event is open to the public. The young Burkinabe who line up to learn Russian are not being coerced. They are making a choice. And that choice reflects something profound about the moment Burkina Faso is living through. But let us not romanticize this. The path is not without challenges. Russian winters are brutal for students from the Sahel. Cultural adjustment is difficult. Language barriers are real and take years to fully overcome. Some students struggle with isolation, with homesickness, with the sheer strangeness of living in a country where everything, from the food to the weather to the social norms, is completely different from what they know. And there are legitimate questions about what happens when these students return. Will the Burkinabe economy be able to absorb them? Will there be jobs that match their skills? Will the knowledge they gained in Russia translate effectively to the realities of a developing country? These are not trivial questions, and the answers will determine whether this educational partnership produces lasting transformation or merely creates a new generation of frustrated graduates. But Traoré seems to understand this. His economic program, the Relance Plan for 2026 to 2030, projects 8% annual growth and aims to lift 2.5 million people out of poverty. It includes massive infrastructure projects, industrial development, and agricultural modernization, all of which will require exactly the kind of trained professionals that the Russian scholarship program is producing. The students are not being trained in a vacuum. They are being trained for a country that is building itself at breakneck speed. There is one more dimension to this story that deserves attention. It is the human dimension, the personal stories of the students themselves. There is the story of a young woman from Ouagadougou who enrolled in the Russian House's language course and told a French journalist that learning the Russian alphabet and a few polite phrases, hello, sorry, and thank you, brought her dream of studying in Russia closer to reality. Her name is Ange Serena Tagnan, and her story is the story of thousands. There are the alumni of Soviet universities, now elderly men and women who attended the Russian House's second anniversary celebration and saw, in the young students performing Russian fairy tales and demonstrating Sambo techniques, a continuation of something they had started decades ago. The thread was never broken, it was only waiting to be picked up again. There are the Burkina-based students currently in Russia, navigating Moscow's metro system, arguing in Russian about thermodynamics, eating borscht for the first time, video calling their families in Ouagadougou to show them the snow. Each one of them is a story. Each one of them is a bridge. Each one of them is a small act of defiance against the idea that Africa's future can only be built with Western tools and Western permission. Captain Ibrahim Traoré once said at the Russia-Africa Summit in St. Petersburg, "We feel like a family in the sense that Russia is a family for Africa. We share the same history. We are the forgotten peoples of the world." 3,500 students. That is 3,500 families whose lives have been changed. 3,500 young people who will return home with skills that their country desperately needs. 3,500 bridges between two civilizations that the old world order tried to keep apart. 3,500 acts of faith in a different future. And this is just the beginning. The quotas are doubling. The applications are surging. The Russian house in Ouagadougou is turning away 12 times more applicants than it can accept. The demand for Russian language courses, for Russian scholarships, for Russian partnership is growing faster than anyone predicted. In the end, this is what sovereignty looks like. Not just the ability to control your own resources or defend your own borders, but the ability to choose who teaches your children, in what language, and for what purpose. For 60 years, that choice was made for Burkina Faso by someone else. Today, Burkina Faso is making it for itself, and 3,500 young people are living proof that the choice is already bearing fruit. Thank you for watching. If this story inspired you, if you believe in the future that Burkina Faso is building, show it. Hit the like button. Write "Long live Traoré" in the comments. Share this video with everyone who needs to understand what is really happening in Africa today. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell, because we have many more stories to tell. Stories the world needs to hear. Stories that prove Africa is not waiting for permission to rise. It is already rising. Until next time, stay informed, stay inspired, and remember, education is the one weapon that no sanction can block, no embargo can stop, and no enemy can take away. Africa is learning, and the world will never be the same.